Like, I'll record it to.
Reddit got?
I got a picture of it. Pretty good.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to get going in just a couple minutes. Just a reminder to folks to please mute your mic when you come in. That way there's no feedback when we have speakers talking. There will be a chance for folks to ask questions. And if you have a question at that time, you can unmute or feel free to throw it in the chat, and I will be watching what's happening in the chat and be able to pop those questions in. All right, let's give it just one more minute. Still some folks joining.
Yana, do you want to make sure your slides are able to go up now?
I can do that.
I see you're flickering, so.
You can see slides, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the
I think it's my camera.
huh?
This happens sometimes to me, so that's why I restarted just to make sure it was all happy, but it didn't solve it all. But usually never a problem with the screen, just my camera.
Weird. Perfect. And you are just a little bit soft too.
I can speak up. Sorry.
Perfect. Well, I guess we can get going. It's just about 5:30. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the Home Hardening Lessons Learned from LA webinar. Thank you guys so much for all being here. Before we get going, I would just like to ask everyone to go ahead and mute yourselves unless it's Q&A, and then also throughout the talk, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will be watching that. So my name is Laura Wisdom. I'm the coordinator for Yosemite Gateway Prescribed Burn Cooperative, and YGPBC is one that's hosting this webinar. We are an organization that's primarily volunteer-based in Mariposa and Eastern Madera counties that helps assist landowners in learning how to use prescribed fire as a land management tool on their properties. So if you're interested in getting involved with us, I'll put my email in the chat and feel free to reach out to me. And then here to speak tonight, we have Yana Valachovic. And Yana, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
So good afternoon or good evening, everyone. I'm Yana Valachovic. I'm a colleague of Allison Deeks, and I have the privilege of been working for the University of California for a long time, and in that process, I've gotten to work all across the state and really pivot a lot of my programming and interest around wildfire impacts on residential communities. My training's in the natural resources and in forestry and in fire. I know a lot about the built environment, and so I kind of work at that intersection between where and how we live and how to think about fire adaptation and mitigation. I've done a fair bit of work in the post-fire environment, trying to learn more about how wildfire impacts our communities and trying to identify pathways where mitigations will be successful. And so, I don't know, Laura, do you want to tell them what you asked me to talk about, or should I just take it from here?
Yeah, I can go over that. So we kind of had broken tonight down into 3 chunks. The first one kind of being home hardening takeaways from the LA wildfires that happened this time last year. Hopefully this is stuff that in our Sierra Foothill mountain homes, we can take as really valuable lessons for how to protect our homes to make them more survivable, since we know that wildfire is a huge issue up here. The second part, we're just going to discuss the Zone 0. I know Yana's been really involved in thinking about and talking about Zone 0 regulations. And I know people that I've talked to in Mariposa and Madera counties have a lot of questions about what that actually means and when that's happening. And then lastly, Yana's going to give an update on kind of the state of fire insurance generally, and At any of those points, you are welcome to throw a question in the chat, and we can pop those in. If you'd like to ask your question in person or unmute, we're going to ask you to hold those until the end, and then we should have time for a Q&A at the end.
Yeah. Okay. Well, appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm gonna launch some things here, and I very much like to tailor to my audience. And so I'm just gonna get this going here. Give me a second. If let's see, how are we doing? Is that working in the right direction, or I need to swap it? Is that correct? Okay, great. The double monitors always gets me a little confused here. So thank you. As I mentioned, and as Laura mentioned, we thought it'd be a good opportunity to look into some of the things that happen in LA and see if there are some relevant concepts that might apply to other locations in California. So I'm going to talk about what I found when I went to Los Angeles in the first couple of weeks following the wildfire. It's an interesting and dynamic time, and if you're been following the news, it has stirred up a lot of interest in kind of what we see in the post-fire environment. What evidence we have to be able to talk about what the pathways are and what the vulnerabilities are. I'm going to talk about real people's homes, real people's lives. So, if this is triggering, please take a pause. I don't mean it to be. And yet, in tragedy, what can we sift through in the ashes to be able to help give better guidance to everyone who lives in this, arid American West? So that's what it's really about. It's and I can be very analytical about it, but I recognize that in every home is a collection of memories and life and stories and lots of things that are hard to talk about in an analytical way. I can see that my camera is doing crazy things, and I apologize about that. If it gets too distracting, let me know and I'll just shut it off. But I think the images are that it will display just correctly here. So part of what I do is really look at that transition between where we see surviving houses and where we see damage or even lost houses. So in both these images, this is from Los Angeles. I think one's from Palisades, one's from Eaton. You can see that there's a lost structure and a surviving structure. And I'm after trying to figure out, well, was there some secret sauce to the ones on the right that helped those structures survive in these firestorms? So what I have set up today is and I was asked to talk about kind of what I learned from LA. Was that different from the work I've done in Paradise, or in Colorado with the Marshall Fire, or with in the Tubbs Fire footprint in Santa Rosa, or with the fires around Redding that had the fire tornado? What about some fires in Orange County in the last decade? And so, I'm just going to kind of take you down what I experienced, and then I'll try and aggregate that out to what some of the key lessons are from all of that. And then I'm going to pivot into talking about policy and state policy and some specific guidance that's coming around defensible space and how that might apply to you all, and what is in that package and how it's evolving. And then I have some space to talk about insurance, and then quite a bit of room for question and answer. If you've got questions that are outside of this, feel free to drop those in the chat, and then I'll try and be ready to pivot to answer some of those. You're going to see for me today a lot of images from Los Angeles, and I know that you all live in the foothills, and you live in ecosystems with oak woodlands and with conifers, and it feels probably very different from the environment in Southern California. And what I'm going to say is that the issues are really similar, and so you might have different styles of construction, use different construction materials, but the issues are really similar. So even though you see here in front of us this image of a palm tree, and then you can see, through where the windows were to the sky and back, because the rest of the building has been burned away. You can replace in your mind, I think, those same types of vegetation basically close to structures. In this case, it probably wasn't the palm tree that burned the house down, but there are, in the very back here, there are some connected trailing vines that could have been that connection point. So I want to walk us through that and help kind of detangle some of the issues. One of the interesting things about Los Angeles is that there's a lot of steel used in place of 2x4s made of wood. And so what that facilitates is that the inside of the contents of the structure burn, but the walls stay together in some situations. And so you get more of this ghost-like image, very different than when you just have wood as the primary member for building. So you end up with more of a pile of rubble. So it gives you a little bit more of that ghost town look. I find that, somewhat sort of artistic and interesting by comparison. So let's see, we're going to take it away here. As you all know, these were fires that happened just about a year ago, red flag warning, and there were multiple fires in the basin. In that whole period of activity, this was unprecedented winds, extremely high wind velocity, and they were sustained for multiple days. I think we all watched it sort of unfold. And there's a lot of conversation since about water and evacuation, and then the sort of comment, were there enough firefighters? What really could have made this event differently? So I'll share some of that and some of what we've learned since then. I think as a community, and sort of my piece in all of this. I went to Los Angeles specifically to look at this pattern and try and understand, well, why is it where the two red lines are, the two arrows, that we have those lost structures, and yet adjacent to them we have two standing structures? Was there something different in the construction codes? Was there something different in how the houses were prepared? Why do we see that uneven pattern? And what I'm going to tell you in this situation is that the construction was not very different between one house to the next, especially in this block. And the work towards managing fuels generally was pretty similar. But what made the difference in many of these locations is kind of a sequence of events and then firefighter response. So I can tell you with some confidence that it's likely that we had firefighter intervention that were protecting these houses in these three locations. And that is what made the difference in these sequences. And what, a lot of our educational programming and our educational efforts are really trying to prevent the sequence so that maybe we don't need that firefighter response and we've got a little more time to dedicate to evacuation and other pieces. I want to tell you, I was embedded with CAL FIRE and their damage inspection team. I also spent some time with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And I just really want to, thank them for letting me get behind these secure lines during that time period. I get a lot of support from a colleague, Dr. Steve Quarles. And this is not, what I'm sharing today is really quick and rapid assessment. It's different from the much more methodical efforts that the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NISTs, are involved in, which generally take more than a year to reconstruct. I'm going to tell you about some rapid work that I did over a certain number of days and a certain number of homes. So, within that, I have a pretty trained eye for what I'm doing, but it's not a statistical study, but it's more observational patterns and processes to help guide that work. And what I want to share with you, like the big ideas from LA, is that the exposures were really uneven. If you look at the picture on the right here, you can see what is the front entry to a house, and very modern style construction house, and you'll see those paper boxes there, the wood, the cardboard boxes. If the exposures were even, this picture was taken right in the middle of the fire footprint, those boxes would have burned. And from there, we might not have seen a movement from those cardboard boxes being burned, leading to more damage on that front porch. But it's a good illustration of how, embers don't go everywhere. You don't have uniform blanket conditions that have uniform exposure across all structures. So when you're looking at survival, there's a lack of uniformity associated with the exposures. There is also different levels of community or first responder response. And then there's different degrees of vulnerability within that. So you end up with this kind of mixed and haphazard pattern. And what I was able to record was a tremendous amount of firefighter intervention, and I'll show you some examples of that. And that is often difficult to see if you don't have the trained eye that I do. And I'll go through some of that in this talk today. The big message that would hope to leave with you today is that when I look at Southern California in particular, the style of development, the type of construction, to me really puts Southern California in a real advantage. I think it's quite achievable to do the full disconnection between the wildland and the community, and then manage some of the near to home.
Hey, Gianna, I'm sorry. I accidentally muted you. There was some background noise. I pressed mute all without thinking about um, muting you.
All right, I'll
Sorry.
start back over here. What I really want to say is that I think Southern California is in a place where it's not all lost. There is a lot of opportunity to think about retrofitting there. And in some ways it feels easier than in some locations, and maybe even easier than where you all live. That's, I think a hard statement to share with you, but there are different styles of construction and there are different materials that are used that tend to be a little bit more resistant to fire. And so I think it's going to make that adaptation element in some ways easier. That is, if the cultural space, if the community is ready to receive that. And I will say a year from, having worked there now, I don't know. There's been a lot of resistance to thinking about what people can do in Southern California. Really, I'm coming from this viewpoint where I want to reduce the exposure. This is shown with the two dials on the bottom, the red line, where I want to, help people think about where they can remove fuels, reduce fuels, or relocate fuels. We'll talk about fuels in a minute, and then harden the structure simultaneously to, help reduce the ignition and fire spread, and really think about how we can harden that infrastructure so that it's in better position. So it's a both and, we're turning two dials simultaneously, and there's a lot to kind of unpack and untangle in that framework. I do want to call out to some work that was done in I can't remember, just not too long ago, and it's this National Institute of Standards and Technologies, the WUI Structure Parcel Community Fire Hazard Mitigation Methodology. And I'll have a link to it at the end here, but it's got a lot of really good ideas around how parcels are configured and thinking about the arrangement of structures on the parcel, and the distance between structures, and kind of how those mitigations play out across lines of ownership, and how we can work together. So there's a lot to unpack in all of this, but I'll just give you some highlights today to talk about like the messages of hope and sort of what we were able to observe in Southern California. Just for some vocabulary building, and I know you all have been working in this space here, so I'll go over this quickly, but just to make sure we're all in the same framework. I think about pathways for wildfire in a three-pronged approach, thinking about how fire comes from somewhere else, often towards structures, and can have a direct contact or direct flame contact. That's the image shown on the very left, where it's traveling through the wildland, and at some point it can run directly to the structure. Saw lots of examples about that in Southern California. And the way you can interrupt that is through fuel modification, so that you can disconnect those pathways, and so it just can't quite make it there. We're going to talk about embers, and embers are pretty widely known these days. They can move long distances, and those embers are pretty insidious. They can get into our houses through open windows, through vents, through dog and kitty doors, underneath garage doors, and other little gaps and places where we have little openings in our structures. And they can also land around the structure and start new spot fires, as shown here in the gutter or in the fuel that's like in right around the base of the building and those foundation plantings. Which can then put direct flame contact on the structure. So in this case, the mitigation would be thinking about how we harden that structure and how we reduce some of those fuels to be able to anticipate that embers might be coming towards a structure in the future. And then we're also going to talk about radiant heat. And, radiant heat really becomes important when structures are closer to each other. Here, this is kind of more an example of kind of the suburban environment where you might have an outbuilding or a detached garage or maybe even a neighbor's house. And once that is involved in fire and in putting off its own heat, the heat transfer through the air from that adjacent structure can lead to a fail point in the primary structure. Here we've illustrated that with windows, and I've got a whole lot of images to look at from Southern California in relation to those windows and the window failing points. So radiant heat, does have both a home hardening and a D-space component in that the defensible space idea would be like, how do we harden that adjacent structure so that maybe it doesn't ignite in the first place? Or how do we harden it as well as the primary structure so that both are more resistive to that type of exposure? So in every situation, there's a multiple pronged approach to be thinking about how we improve the resistance of our structures to fire exposures. I want to really underscore that it's different than resilience, because resilience is the ability to recover. And we want resilient communities, but we also want resistant structures, and they're different. There are tons and tons of images out there about the ember cast that occurred in Southern California. And if you need any of the images, I didn't embed any videos into this talk today, but this is one that was pretty well moved around in the media around the McDonald's, and there's a palm tree, and you can just to see the number of detected firebrands. And if you've watched the new weathered PBS film that just came out 1 year after, just on January 7th, it's got some great illustrations of embers. And a big ember cast leads to a lot of exposure potential. And embers come in many different sizes. On the bottom right is a picture of my hand with a relatively large one. They can be smaller, and the smaller ones are the ones that find ways into our vents and inside of our buildings, because they can pass through the vent, through even the screen to get in, unless we have a screen that is designed to resist that type of exposure. So here's another kind of view of embers. And what I like about this is, even though it's a still image, it shows the dynamicy of air patterns and movements. And I'd love, if anyone hasn't seen this image and hasn't seen me talk about this, if you could tell me where, or at least think about where the wind might be coming from. Which direction is the wind moving? And how might you know which direction the wind is moving? Like, you can see these swirling patterns, and then you can see things that are on, fire, and maybe the grasses are on fire, but how can we detect where the wind is? And what I want to share with you is it may not be the way you think. Most people think, because of the way this pattern is and this pattern here, is that the wind is moving from the firefighter side to the left. But in actuality, it's the opposite of that. And why I'm bringing that up is because what's happening is the wind is intersecting with this building. That's what's creating the vortexing, both the vertical and the horizontal vortexing. But it is moving from left to right. And what is happening is the wind is colliding and carrying the embers with it, with this wall here. And the embers don't stick to that wall. They, in fact, abruptly stop and then drop to the base. And you see them aggregating and collecting at the base of the wall here. And why that's important is it shows to me like how um, easy it is to have fire coming from some far away location and then all of a sudden rapidly exposing the edge of our structures. And those edges are often unprotected, even with stucco assembly. Sometimes there can be some gaps at the base of the wall to allow the weep edge to function, or if it is a wood cladded building, then you see an unprotected edge at the base. And if you get ignition of material, mulch or dry plants or bushes and hedges or stored wood right here, all of a sudden you've got direct flame contact on the structure and right at that unprotected edge. So when we talk about defensible space later, really what we're talking about is how you think about protecting these incredibly vulnerable locations like the edge of the wall or the under eave area where it collects a lot of the heat as well as can be exposed to embers by these vortexing patterns here. So using an image like this, I think helps me understand like why my under eave area is vulnerable, and why, if I have a siding that goes all the way to the base of the wall, like how comfortable can I be about fuel that might accumulate there, either intentional or get blown in. So I'm going to show you a number of videos today, and I'll talk through them. This one comes from Texas. It's a couple of years ago, and we get an ignition from this highway here. It runs through grass, and then it intersects with this residential community. We're just going to show you a minute or so of it. What I want you to pay attention to is the connected fuels. And what's going to happen is that the fire is going to run into the back of the fence, which is, segregating this open field from this residential area, containing our pets and providing a safe place for our kids to play. But then that fence becomes the connected fuel, which then links to the detached garages and the outbuildings, and then which leads to radiant heat issues. So just to kind of watch how this plays out. So there was a helicopter that was observing this whole fire, and here you can see we've connected to the fence. It's spreading through the fence into the shed. It's spreading down now the parallel fence between these two structures. It's moving through the managed grass, and it's starting to encounter built environment fuels. It's getting radiant heat exposures increasing. And, in a relatively short amount of time, less than 10 minutes, we've got the shed burning. And then in a couple more minutes, we're going to start to see that the attics are engaged. Like here, we've got it. And, this whole thing transpires in a very quick fashion. And, we've built our structures with this layout in mind of either lot sizes or something that we can manage, and how do we contain our, as I said, our pets, and keep our children in out of harm's way and close by, and keep the deer out, and have our gardens and all those things. But the connectivity between all of that is the vulnerability. And so, some thought and attention about, just making little breaks along those wicks of connectivity so that we can give a little more time and separation for our structures. Today, I'm not going to go in exhaustive detail about home hardening. I'm just going to illustrate mostly through videos and photos kind of what I saw respective in Los Angeles to kind of give some more information around this, like roof to wall intersection, or fence to house, or embers coming in through the eaves. There's a lot more to talk about that, and hopefully I'm sort of whetting your whistle and your appetite for these topics to be able to think through each of the pieces on our structures and how they may elevate in priority based on your particular situation. In all cases, though, we need three things. We need a roof that's in good shape, of Class A rating, so that ability to resist fire for a certain duration of time. We need vents to be upgraded so that they're ember resistant and potentially flame resistant, depending on where they're located. And then we need combustibles removed from the surrounding base of the structure. And that's in closer towards that zone zero concept. After that, as density increases, then we have to think more about the radiant heat issues, and I'll go through some of those in a minute. Um, I created a little clip art illustration just to sort of talk about what happened in both Eaton and Palisades fires, where you get, in one case it's a power line, in another case it's a fire that got stirred up that was thought to be out. It starts traveling through the wildland vegetation. In relatively short time, it encounters the backyards of our residential communities, and then it moves into more of the cultivated and manicured landscape, intersects with the fence, and then you've got this fire kind of running directly, and the fence is attached to the structure, and then you've got flame contact that has come from the wildland through our backyards to the structure itself. And the same time, because this was a fire that had a lot of wind associated with it, you've got embers being picked up. Embers are traveling long distance, and they, start to move into the interior of our residential communities, and they find their ways into these structures, or create new spot fires adjacent to the structures. And then you move to that place where you get that house to house intersection, where you've got some people are calling it urban conflagration, but you get basically a lot of radiant heat buildup. That's putting pressure on the adjacent structures, putting pressure on the windows, and then you get more embers that are associated with those burning buildings, and the process kind of continues. And then you get this kind of runaway chain reaction that starts to occur. There's also multiple lines of pathways, so it's not always moving linearly, and you can get different pathways down hedges, and so you can have multiple exposure points throughout the event. And so, kind of thinking about it in this, set of sequence pieces, what I would like to have people think about is how can they break that wick? Where can they do some modifications so that if you get fire in the wildland, that it's not running directly at the structure, that there's something that's going to break that point of connection, and that might give some ability for this house to be able to withstand that exposure. And conversely, as we start to move into the interiors of our communities, that we've done some of that home hardening. So when the embers start to show up, just from the wildland associated fuels, that they have much less receptive materials when they land in those locations. That's going to give our firefighters a whole lot more time to do direct attack on fewer structures and to help work in evacuation. Because we all know that to do direct structure response takes several engines and a lot of resources. And once you get a whole lot of buildings that are all ignited, that puts tremendous strain on our water resources, and that water just starts pumping out of those lost and burned buildings, and then the whole firefighter resource infrastructure starts to decline. So people kind of couldn't imagine that fire could run all the way to the ocean. It ran out of fuel, that's why it stopped. This is the Pacific Coast Highway, and fire came in Palisades over the hill, and then with embers were able to pass into this line of structures right at the transition to.
This attached gate was wood. Looks like maybe someone pushed it away. I'll walk along side of this building. You can see the tempered glass breakage from this burning side of this building. Here's where the gate was, and definitely there was firefighter response. You can see here that the gate was cut away, and that disconnected this burning building from this one. This building took a lot of heat while it was tempered glass. Look at the buckle up there, and both layers were damaged.
So I'm showing you this video because I find it really interesting when you look at, here's this whole line of structures, and it encounters this one here. What enabled this one to survive? And it's two parts. One, someone came in and cut the gate away. And then in this case, where the buildings were really close to each other, they had installed 3 panes of tempered glass in this window. It took a huge amount of heat, but the window didn't completely fail, and it prevented the fire from entering into the whole structure. Yes, it was made of stucco, but the weak point would be this window. And so to me, it's a really great line of evidence where if you're thinking about a potential radiant heat exposure, you can see how a window detail was really successful. Here's another example. This is in Altadena. The fire was in this residential community. Fire was moving down the property along this fence. The fence takes a hard left and starts running towards the structure. And what I found here is that someone had actually cut the gate away. And there may have been some water applied as well. But you can see that there was an intervention that basically prevented the continuance of the fire directly touching the structure. So when you hear comments around defensible space and breaking the wick and upgrading gates, this would be an example where if this had been a metal gate attachment, you could still lose this outside fence that's wood, but when it encounters the metal gate, then it doesn't, the fire doesn't have any more where to travel, and it stops at that location. If you are not in the situation where you haven't replaced your gate, like upon evacuation, if you could tie your gate open, keep it away from the fence, that would be at least an interim approach. So just kind of thinking about how we might break those connections. Here are two examples of vegetation. In both cases, I've got strong evidence of firefighter response. The one on the left here, it is a hedge, green on the outside, dry on the inside. Fire traveled down that hedge, then runs into, and I don't know exactly which species of decorative conifer this is. There's some juniper here. You get fire engagement in this vegetation. And then that is passing flame and heat onto the fascia. The fascia engages, but there was an engine that was able to stop that forward progression. You rarely get extinguishment once a building is involved. And so, when you see something frozen in time, it gives you a good indication that someone was there to prevent the further progression of that. On the right-hand side, this is from Palisades. And, they've got this really nice non-combustible walkway, very nice irrigated green lawn here, but there's like a foot long, 8-inch wide, or 12 inches, 8-inch wide little section of vegetation right underneath the eave. There's some irises here, and then there's this shrub here that I would argue is kind of too big for its britches because it's run into the underside of the eave here, and there was some dry material, and that got ignited by embers, and then someone came and put that out. They lost the garage in the situation. There were examples of where the dry doormat had been pulled away. There were other signs of intervention in here. So this would have continued, and these were actually single pane windows on the bottom, double pane on the top. So it would have been pretty easy to get fire into that structure. So just an example of how a little detail helped in this situation. I want to call some attention to garbage and recycling receptacles because, they are fuel, and I kind of think of them now as incendiary devices. And I have this weird association of the 8 or 9 fires that I've had post-fire work on. I think almost all of them have been on garbage day, which is weird. But, we often put material in our garbage and recycling receptacles and it doesn't fit. And so the lid doesn't fully close, and it's got kind of like a mouth open. And so embers, can come into that garbage can. And, there's so many petroleum-based products that we're throwing away. There's paper products that we're throwing away. And all of a sudden you can get engagement of that garbage or recycling receptacle, and you have a tremendous amount of heat. So in this case, you can see where there was a fence here, and then there's this horrible green ooze everywhere, and that's actually the sign of the green garbage or recycling receptacle that burned in this particular location. It was all stucco construction on the side. There were no windows. That's what helped here. But there also was some firefighter response that kept this from further progressing. So, like you're not going to see regulations around garbage and recycling receptacles, but thinking about education around them and where to place them, and if you have enough time to evacuate, maybe moving them into the garage or putting them somewhere far away. The other thing I see with them is on wind times, they tend to fall over or get blown over, and then all the material moves, is blown all around, and all of a sudden you're basically just relocating the fuels that were in the garbage can and spreading them throughout the yard. So, a difficult issue to solve, but I think one to be aware of. And, part of my work, I'm really looking for those pathways. And here you can see where there was a decorative hedge, right, all along this whole section here. And, the level of burn here is a pretty good indication that one pathway into this structure was from this vegetation, and that heat led to window failure. There could have been other elements associated with pathways into the structure in this situation, but gives some reflection on the window vulnerability in that situation. I'm gonna share another little video here. Oh, this one, not a lot of audio, but you can see the backyard. This is in Altadena. And in this case, there's a lot of use of cement and pavers, and there's quite a bit of disconnection. You can see a metal gate, this block wall here, that really helped contain the fire from the other adjacent property to this one. Another metal gate internally here. Garbage can that didn't blow over. That was really a fantastic one. When you look over, you're like, oh, wow, look at the amount of heat that was coming off that adjacent structure as it burned. And that block wall was really helpful for kind of buffering some of that heat. Again, the stucco here generally, much less combustible, so helpful. But here you can see that was the water shut off. Then there was probably some wood mulch around here that ignited, the fence or the gate ignited, and then along this whole wall was a decorative ficus. So some people don't like the linearity, the blockiness of the block wall, and so pretty common practice in Southern California to see a ficus climb over or being planted so it spreads along the wall and softens it. And I'm sure that makes it much more pleasant to be adjacent to, but it also becomes the wick that fire can travel down, even though you've got this non-combustible wall. So in this case, there was just, either intentional or not, enough disconnection that it really helped this house do better than the adjacent one. Here, I'll got just a couple more. I hope you like these. Flip it around a little bit so that we can get some wider view on what this looks like, and we're at this interesting place where we've got some damaged and some lost structures. Mountain view behind us. And you can see the damage on the stucco siding. And there actually isn't a lot of fascia damage, to my surprise. What we've been seeing in this fire is that the stucco construction helps hold in the heat as the building burns, and then it later collapses, which is likely what is slowing some of the heat damage onto the adjacent building. But walking down this way, you can see that this gate was really critical and not wicking the fire to the building, where here is the remnants of the wooden fence that was separating the two properties. So that non-combustible gate, in my mind, was really critical for preventing fire spread from that adjacent structure and then the fence to this building. So, just another reflection on the value of disconnecting those fuels. This was a fascinating house to me. Here's an older home. This is in Altadena, and it's like one of the few standing homes in this area, and not a lot of evidence of any type of intervention. But what struck me as I walked around it is that these were tempered glass windows that were added, and it was an upgrade where the tempered glass windows really helped ward off or protect the structure from the heat that was coming from this adjacent one. So here's an older home with a new roof and tempered glass windows, and it did really well, and really refreshing to see that. I saw a lot of houses that look like this. You'll see a lot of vinyl windows, especially from the 80s and 90s. And you see these little stringy looking things, and what they are is basically where the glazing held the window pane in is. So the vinyl window got a metal frame, but they use vinyl glazing to hold the window pane in. It takes a lot of heat, and that vinyl starts to peel back. And then what happens is that the window panes fall out. And so then you've got a way for heat and flames to enter the structures. You know, this is a replacement job that's better, but it just gives you a sense of like how in a world where they use more stucco, how the windows become the next fail point. Screens are kind of useful because they also, even if the window pane fails or cracks, they're still keeping the embers out. So the screens do have some additional service value. So I hope you like these videos.
Working in reverse on this property, here's a excellent zone 0, and that really seemed to hold this structure together. As I'm moving around, there are a few combustible items that are near to this building, but for the most part, this patio provided a lot of protection. Over here, you can see that the adjacent structure was consumed by fire. But again, another good example of zone 0. The fire did start to come over the top of the block wall where it's covered in this woody climbing vine. And here you can see an example of where fire just about started on the structure. But through defensive action, and I'll get my shadow out of the way, I'll flip around. Someone came through and kicked open the gate. I'm guessing the gate was locked, enabling them to open the gate, maybe throw some water on it, and keep the gate from carrying the fire to the structure. So the adjacent structure looks like all the other ones we've seen in this community. But here, we see that this house made it through. Working in
So, you know, I guess just to bring us back to the kind of close on LA, the exposures were uneven, lots of firefighter intervention, and you can just see the walkways that they use here, that there's so much non-combustible ways that they finish their patios, a lot of metal fences. So some small work, and I think we could reduce a lot of the fuel that's right adjacent to those structures, and then just being more thoughtful about some of the home hardening elements that come into play, especially where, you know, these are much more dense patterns of development than where a lot of you all live. But I think even in some of your small towns, you can see that kind of similar structure separation, and maybe this can help illustrate how we might think about kind of an all buildings approach, because even if the adjacent structure isn't one of significant value, it still could be the domino that puts some significant pressure on the primary structure. So I'm going to kind of wrap up here, and I just want to bring us back to this concept around evacuation and, you know, thinking in your situation. I know you've had a bunch of wildfires, so maybe you're feeling a little practiced about this, but, you know, just want to give a big plug for signing up for the alerts, thinking about the communication plan that you need to have within your family, within your community. One of the best recommended practices is to have a point of contact where you are communicating that's outside of your zip code, outside of your area, and, you know, a place where you're all checking in, because, you know, so much of our communication infrastructure often goes down in these kinds of events, and you need a place to be able to call in or get get communication in, and you need to know what the phone number is. I mean, I think that's a real problem these days. I barely know my kids' phone numbers at this point because they're young and I have just had them on, dial, and I don't have to punch in the number anymore. So that practice of learning how to remember numbers is really important. I think we've seen from some other fires, especially like the ones in Paradise, in the foothills, this idea of temporary refuge areas as being another critical concept where, and I brought this, image from Altadena, and you can see kind of the hot spots, and you can see that whole blocks got engaged, and, your plan for evacuation may be compromised. I think one of the things we learned from the campfire in Paradise is that the fire came from a different direction. People had always planned for the fire to be coming from the valley up into the foothills. And in fact, it came from the east and burned to the west. So most people's minds had been prepped for a different pattern of evacuation, one that they had experienced in the past. That's where fires had come from. And so they anticipated that that's where it would come from in the future, and were caught off guard. And so, there are some good lessons around having some places that you can temporarily shelter in and be able to stage from. Golf courses are a great example. Big parking lots are a good example. But the number one thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to drive through fire. And, the problem is the heat, and the problem is the heat on your lungs. And, our lungs just really can't handle that heat. We heard about in the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa that some people, took shelter in their pools, and they both almost got hypothermia, but then the air was so hot around them that they were having really hard time being able to breathe. So, thinking carefully about this, and I don't know, Allison and others that are, working within the community response space, but this is one thing to really spend some time considering and thinking through. And also the issue of, practice evacuation, and how to really understand what might happen, and how to kind of have the muscle memory to do it, and the muscle memory for the next gen to be able to do it. I've heard some great stories of like communities that are doing events with kids, and they're learning how to use CB radios, and they're doing treasure hunts, and things that are fun activities, and using that to help develop skills in the radio, so that when communication goes down, you may have an alternate form of it. So, just putting some other ideas out there, and then being certain that people have planned for your pets. One of the reasons our roads get so clogged is because, we wait to the end, and we're struggling to get our pets and get everybody accounted for. And, it's a very challenging moment. So I know we're going to take questions at the end, but I think it's always good to have more conversation around this evacuation piece, and to recognize that if you wait too long and you leave and you think you're going to make it through, it may be better to stage somewhere else, and even in a building, than it is to be caught in your car. And just to be aware of how we protect our airways in these situations. Um, you know, I've kind of brushed over these home hardening priorities. I know that Allison has some of my materials, and we've put together quite a bit on our UC Fire website to really go through these more specific elements, and to recognize the vulnerabilities along our structures. So, I was showing you examples today of a lot of stucco buildings, not so common where you are. And just to like think about, the roof, the vents, and that first 5 feet is all being critical. But then where building density increases, the hardness and the resistance of the windows is really important. The protection of the edge of the wall is really important. We often have illustrations where we've got, some additional clearance. And here's an example where, you kind of show that the siding doesn't go all the way to the base of the foundation. And, so if you get ignition right here at the bottom of the wall, and this case, it's a hardened element, and so it gives some more buffering to the wood that is shown here as the siding. we can talk about that more in Q&A if you'd like. And so, I want to just kind of wrap up this section and answer the question, are the issues different in forested locations? And I would argue that they're really not. Our vulnerabilities in our buildings are pretty consistent. The difference that you might see between here and Los Angeles is that in a taller vegetation environment, you end up with a lot more movement of fine debris like leaves and needles. And what that does is that stuff clogs up our gutters. And so the fire vulnerability may be much more along the roof edge where the gutter, which is protecting the wall from too much water and from rain, gets clogged with debris that's ignitable, and embers ignite the gutter itself. And then if you get ignition at the gutter, then you've got flames putting pressure on the direct edge of the roof. And depending on how the roof is maintained and how it's assembled, you might get fire, kind of coming underneath the roof decking and working its way into the interior of the building. So, in the Marshall Fire, where it was a grassland fire in Colorado, gutters weren't so much of a big deal because there wasn't tall trees. Where you all live, tall trees become more of a consideration, and the fuels associated with the surface fuels coming from all of that debris coming down becomes an additional component. So, as I wrap up kind of this element associated with Los Angeles, and then we'll move into Zone 0. There are many scales to be working at, and we've been mostly talking about the mitigations at the home scale. But as we aggregate together, such a great environment to be able to show the neighbors what you've done and be able to brag about the work that you've done and hopefully inspire the neighbors. And, together, then you can start thinking about how that aggregates out to both a neighborhood and a community scale. And, working together, rowing all in the same direction is, the ultimate goal. You certainly can have recalcitrant people or people who don't have the means or the ability to do that work. And so then how can we rally around them? How can we help support them? Are they having physical limitations? Are they having financial limitations? What is it exactly? Are they absentee? Do they only, vacation there? Or, what does it look like? And trying to lean in and understand and meet them where they're at and help, and work together. To address those issues that we're all in it together, but we have to start somewhere. And so I just really encourage you to start at your scale, which is your home and your kind of immediacy, and then working together to help lift collectively. There's a lot of joy and beauty in all of that. So, what does the future hold in the LA Basin? There's going to be future wildfires. There's no doubt about that. I think, there's going to be long-term issues associated with evacuations and a number of components there. There's been a lot of, policy opportunities. LA chose not to adopt the standards associated with the higher fire mitigation standards. So people are sort of voluntarily choosing to build back with more resilience or resistance into the structures. That could be a missed opportunity. But I understand why there's so much pressure to help get people on their feet as quickly as possible. So I'm going to transition now to kind of this third part, or the second part, which is thinking about defensible space. And I'm going to get into some minutia here. So, California has long been a leader in thinking about fuel mitigation. The concept of defensible space was really an idea that came from California, and it was put on the books in California in 1965. And then in 2006, we moved from Zone 1 to Zone 2. So Zone 1 is 0 to 30 feet. Zone 2 is 30 to 100 feet. And we've been operating since 2006 under that framework. In 2020, so 14 years later, there was legislation passed known as AB 3074, which said, hey, we haven't been talking about embers, and we're missing some of the key ingredient in this defensible space framework, and we really need to kind of dial in and focus right around the structure itself. And then in 2024, there was some additional work to that initial round of legislation to try and kind of unstuck some things and give some greater clarity. So this is in policy work, and the regulatory authority lies with the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, which is an independent board that has both fire and forestry experience. And they're responsible for writing the enabling regulations that come from the policy change. I'm just giving you, for those of you who, I'm going to lift the hood a little bit on for those of you who think about this. There's been some tension between what is in the state responsibility area versus what's in the local responsibility area. So local fire has control over local issues, and CAL FIRE has control over the state responsibility area issues. And these combined pieces of legislation said same standards for both state responsibility area and local responsibility area. Also said that the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection should work with the state fire marshal to develop the regulations. It also said defensible space applies to all fire weather conditions, not just average fire weather conditions. That Zone 0 is intended to address embers. And then this is really critical, that new and existing structures should meet the same standards. In other words, we're not just going to think about the new buildings that we're building. We're going to also be conscious about the vulnerability that exists in all the homes that we have across California. And then specifically that existing structures have at least a 3-year grace period to come in to meet the standards, and that there was support for phasing the work. So you don't have to do everything in year one, that you can kind of work it as it makes sense and be able to show forward progress on it. If you've been following this, the board had a long pause between 2023 and 2025, and they were given release to be able to work on this again, especially after the significance of the fires in Los Angeles. And so they rejiggered how they were going to work on that and developed a committee specifically to work on Zone 0, and it included 3 members. It includes the chair of the board. They've been meeting monthly since March of 2025, and they've taken in thousands and thousands of public comments, written, oral comments. In December, they were on track to release a kind of a close to final draft, but they decided to take a little pause because it was getting very hot and contentious. A lot of folks in Southern California in particular were really upset about that enabling or the development of these regulations. And so the board's been in the backdrop working on some of the economic analysis as well as a guidance document that's a part of the package. And where we are now is we expect an update in March and then public meetings in April and May. What I can share with you is that we anticipate a final version this spring that will support and be clear that trees are allowed in Zone 0 as long as the ladder fuels are managed, meaning that the lower branches are addressed. There's going to be, guidance around removing the wooden combustibles such as the gate and the mulch. And that the document will also address the vegetative fuels that are in those first 5 feet around the structure. So I know that probably is not quite what you're looking for, but I just want to say that's kind of the status of where we're at. Some colleagues of mine did some work in response to requests that came from the city of Berkeley, who and their fire department, because they've been developing their own Zone 0. And we were getting a lot of questions at the state level as well at the local level, like, what happens to plants, and do the plants themselves, especially well irrigated hedges, help protect structures? And so in rapid order, we were able to put together a very quick experiment with some support from a number of different groups. I'm calling it "What's a Hedge Got to Do with It?" just for some humor about it. And so the question was, do foundation plantings, like surrounding a structure, do they help buffer the structure from the radiant heat of a small burning shed? And this was done outside in modest temperatures, so it was in the 70s, and we were able to create a 15-mile-an-hour winds. So not critical fire weather, but what is the role of this irrigated, maintained shrub line? And does it attenuate, take in some of that heat and protect the structure, or does it become additive fuel? And so I just thought I'd share with you this because it's really helping frame my mind around some of this work. So we did 3 treatments, 4 replicates, and the tests included no plants, a healthy, hydrated, very much wet plant, and then one that was drought stressed. And I'll show you kind of how this all lays out. And this is, just to bring a little nerd factor into all of this. It looks like this from a bunch of different perspectives. We basically created a wall, which we instrumented and then put a line of big plants. They're in big 5-gallon pots that we had bought from the nursery and received and maintained, just before the experiment. So they're healthy, they're in good condition, though we removed water from a set of them so that we'd have some ones that are drought stressed. And then what happened is we used pellets to create what would be about a fuel equivalent of a small shed, like a pump shed or something like that. Put fans on it, pushed the wind to push the flames towards the structure itself. And what we found out is that basically the wet plants and the dry plants burned at the same time. They burned within 2 minutes. And so there was a little bit of buffering, but even very green, very wet plants took that heat on, and it's enough. It happens so quickly that basically the stomata shut down because they're trying to protect themselves. They can't suck the water that's in the pot up, and they begin to desiccate, and then they dry, and then they're able to ignite. So, this was just with 15-mile-an-hour winds at a 70-degree day. This is not critical fire weather conditions. So, thinking about greenness as being a buffer, I think is an interesting conversation piece. And when you think about hedges in particular, is they're often green on the outside, but if you stick your hand in the middle of it, there's dry, dead stuff in there, especially because we tend to shear them and that dry stuff sits on the inside. Boxwood is a great example, really flammable, even though it looks green and supple. So in our experiment, we didn't have any surface fuels or dead materials, and they were really in their best condition possible. So, in thinking about Zone Zero, and there's a lot of interest and debate around could there be safe plants? What would they look like? How long do they take to burn? What if they don't produce that much heat? What if? The challenge we have right now is that we don't have a standard protocol for testing plants in Zone Zero. We don't know what condition we're concerned about. Is it on a day when we have 40-mile-an-hour winds, 15-mile-an-hour winds? What is it? Is it on a day where it's been dry for the previous 3 days and so everything's pretty crispy? Or is it under moderate humidity? Like, what exactly is the testing scenario that we're curious about? And then there's this further challenge. Here's 3 different building examples. This one is on the top right is this covered trailer, and you can see the wood steps, you can see all the dry stuff around it, doesn't have a true real foundation. The one on the right, stucco construction, a lot of mulch, how's the edge protected at the base of the wall in that condition, versus the one in the middle, which is, a shingle siding, and it's got a skirting that's wood, and the sill plate is wood there, and each of these structures have different degrees of vulnerability. So what building environment are we talking about? And what's the level of maintenance? Like, what should the standard be? Or are we trying to come up with different testing protocols for different types of buildings? And are we testing radiant heat? Are we testing flame contact or embers? Like, what is it exactly? And the challenge is that California doesn't have any of that socialized, and it doesn't have a testing facility to evaluate plants. And it's not easy to replicate those different types of exposures in any testing facility, except for the one that's in South Carolina at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. So we've got a bit of a conundrum where people are wanting a high degree of assurance around certain plants, but yet we really haven't formulated the environment that we're curious about and that we're concerned about, and we don't really know what the building standards should be. So, right now, without any of that figured out, it has to be something that's applied ubiquitously to all structures, and there is no ability to really think about what that weather condition environment should be. So, I showed you this earlier, this idea that embers accumulate at the base of the wall. So what's the level of protection on the edge here? What happens in the under eave area? And so, as I've been thinking about defensible space and this zone zero idea, I've been I've been pivoting to being more coherent and really talking about what people's structures look like themselves and how much heat, if any, flame contact they can take. How is the edge of the wall put together? And here in the wood environment, you often just have shingles that come down to the edge of the foundation, and there's nothing that protects that edge, as an example. And you may not have a very tall foundation, so everything is like right close to the ground. And even in the situation where you have stucco, this image on the left, a little hard to see, but what that is at the base of the wall, kind of like in this situation, I stuck my camera underneath and you can see the house wrap. That's what that plasticky looking white stuff is. And that house wrap comes all the way into the right underneath the wall. And that house wrap is made of plastic, and plastic's a petroleum product, and that is easily ignited. If you ignite that house wrap, it just carries the fire right behind the stucco and into the wall itself. So how we finish the edges of our walls is highly variable, but they have vulnerability to them. And so how much can your wall edge handle fire? That is a complicated question to answer, but I think is really critical when we start talking about what Zone Zero is trying to address and what it isn't. Conversely, there's another issue associated underneath the edge of the eaves themselves. And here you can see that the edge of the eave traps heat. Flames come up and press up against it. And the edge of the eave is very different on many different structures. Some cases we have on the right where these open eaves and freeze block vents. Sometimes we have a soffit with a strip vent. And we have lots of gaps and weaknesses in those locations, and many houses can't take very much heat at all, or they've got very specific vulnerabilities with gaps and joints between the block vents and the blocking themselves. And so, one building could take more heat than another one. And, Zone Zero is really trying to be thoughtful and think about, a variety of conditions, and the idea that really most of our under eaves can't take very much flame, heat, or embers in general. So that's how I've kind of wrapped my head around what Zone Zero is trying to address, is being able to think specifically about the building itself and create, a standardized approach, given that our building vulnerabilities are so different. So, we think from the wildland more about this concept of ladder fuels and the stair stepping of fire from the surface to the shrubs to the taller vegetation. And we can kind of see that same pattern as it moves closer to our structures and is in our cultivated landscape, as well as some of our built environment like these fences. So, kind of reinforcing and bringing this all back front and center is this idea of kind of what is fuel, and how do we reduce the exposure to that fuel and kind of manage that fuel. And it can come on the top left, like artificial turf. It can be the garbage cans, the RVs, the cars that are close to our structures. It can be the fences. It can be mulch. It even can be, I'm sadly to say, the hot tub. And I saw a number of hot tubs in Los Angeles. I didn't want to think that. But hot tubs are often skirted in wood, and they've got wood steps that you climb out of. And they're just like the wood steps like on our structures, just as much. And so it's not that hard to get the wood steps ignited. It's not that hard from then to get the wood skirting ignited. And then it takes a while for the tub itself to fail. And that's often after you've had quite a bit of fire burning before the water then may, rush out and put it out. But it's just, we put them really close to our structures. And so just to kind of recalibrate our eyes around what that is. I think I have shown you some of these foundation plantings, these hedges, and like the vines on the block wall, that kind of traditional vegetation. That is certainly fuel in and of itself. This defensible space guidance is trying to speak from an educational framework around all of these issues and help people understand how they interplay with our most valuable asset, which is typically our homes. So earlier I showed you this pathways and transitions concept, and what zone 0 is after is really trying to break some of that wick, where you replace the gates so that if fire comes closer to the structure, it doesn't run into the structure. You harden some of the structure so the embers aren't necessarily as successful in finding places to create bigger fires, and you remove some of that near to building fuels so that you don't have all that connectivity, and that works to slow down fire progression and give us a lot more time. So I'm sure I'm stimulating some idea of questions. I look forward to getting to you in that in just a minute. Just got a couple more things to talk about respective to fire and insurance. So I'm gonna take a moment and drink a little water. Hope you're all hanging in, and amazed that you're doing a webinar at this evening time. And insurance is a real bugaboo right now. I know we're all feeling it. There's lots and lots of examples, especially in your part of the world where people are losing insurance, have lost insurance, left with a fair plan. So I'm going to walk us through kind of where we got to this moment, and I'll do a little forecasting around how I think we're setting up to move forward in hopefully some positive ways. So, I guess just stepping back for a second, the insurance market has been and continues to be vulnerable to large scale natural disasters. If you think about earthquakes, which is one of the big disasters that we struggle with in this state, we had a lot of problems. And it wasn't really until earthquake insurance was separated from a homeowner's policy that things stabilized there. Pulling fire out of the insurance policies could kind of be a strategy, except for there's not much left in our insurance if we did that. And so it's not really a recommended action here. So the 2017 and 2018 wildfire season, so that's the Tubbs fire, then the Carr fire, the Camp fire, just a substantial wake up. And that's also coupled with hurricane and tornado aspects across the US. And so that really brought this whole rethinking about climate related changes and instability into the insurance industry. And so fire is a component of a broader conversation around how insurance is reacting to these things that are likely fueled by levels of change that in some cases can be strongly attributed to climate related changes. So, the insurance industry understands that, and they've been trying to figure out how to address that. At the same time, we have a proposition called Proposition 103 that was put together in 1988. And its goal, so this is a state proposition, signatures are collected, it gets put on the ballot, we all sign for it, aims to provide consumer protection and rate stabilization. And that established the California Insurance Commissioner and gave the commissioner the authority to approve rates for both property and casualty insurance. It also enabled interveners or members of the public to witness and participate in the insurance reviews. So there's a lot of time it takes to review insurance rates and insurance changes. So that's part of what is making it difficult for us to feel the the approach that's being taken right now as a state strategy around this, because the process is sort of long and there's a number of steps to it to review and approve rates. You all have heard of the FAIR Plan. Its origin is 1968. It's following the riots and fires in Southern California, and has created the insurance plan of, quote, last resort. Other states have insurance plans of last resort, not a uniquely California thing. And the FAIR Plan is associated with all admitted insurers in California. There are insurers that are not admitted, but there are admitted insurers. And the FAIR Plan has its costs distributed among the carriers themselves. So it's not just on the ratepayers, it's on the carriers themselves. And it provides fire insurance. It's been around 3% of all insurance plans in California. But last year I saw some statistics that about 10%, 8 to 10% of all new real estate transactions have been backed by the FAIR Plan, meaning that it's becoming more and more important in the real estate transaction space. And as a result, the exposure and the liability is increasing, as well as the market solvency of the FAIR Plan. So the way it works right now, if you're an admitted insurance carrier, so that's like your State Farms and the bigger companies that we all know about, they are responsible for the percentage of business that they have in the state. So if they're 10% of the market in the state, they're responsible for 10% of the claims in the state. So it's an uncomfortable place to be if you're a big insurer, because you've got more exposure associated with the FAIR Plan. And the way the FAIR Plan works is you have to create a two policy system. I'm sure many of you know this. You have the fire plan, which is the FAIR Plan, and then your liability, theft, and water related issues are covered by a difference in condition, or DIC policy. So the two together provide that comprehensive coverage and are critical for your loan if you have a mortgage. What we've seen is more and more folks are going bare, meaning that if they paid their mortgage off, they don't have insurance, which is a really risky proposition. And then we've also seen that a lot of folks are increasing their deductibles significantly just to lower their premium, because that's maybe one way to deal with a catastrophe, but maybe the chronic issue is something that they can weather more. It's a very uncomfortable place for all of us as, I think, homeowners, to be able to manage the change in costs, certainly with this. I want to give some little sense about the insurance landscape. So we are the policy holders, and then there are insurance companies in the United States, and the California Insurance Commissioner admits and regulates the insurance carriers in the United States. So they are mostly US companies. There are some California companies. But they get insurance from other folks. That's the top line. The reinsurers, those folks tend to be international at scale, and they are mostly outside of California's authority to be able to try and corral them. And what we've seen is that the reinsurance companies are putting tremendous pressure on the insurance companies, and they haven't been able to pass all of that increase in rates onto us. So we've seen reinsurance go up 25% plus a year to the insurance companies, and while our rates have gone up, they haven't gone up that much. So what the insurers have been asking California is to try and figure out some mechanism to pass through reinsurance increases onto us as policyholders. They've been asking to have consumers take on a share of the liability in the FAIR Plan, so it's not just on the insurers, but it's also on the customers. They've also been asking for forecasting models or catastrophe models to help inform the rates. And then they have been asking for the Department of Insurance to accelerate rate filing approvals. So that has been the demands. And just to share what I know, what the response has been to develop what's called the Sustainable Insurance Strategy. And that came about late in 2024, and it started to take place into 2025. And it's, the whole process is just kind of slow in how it rolls out. And so I think and I'm optimistic that in 2026 we're going to start to see some of this. So the goal has been to basically allow meet some of the insurers' demands, like allowing for catastrophe modeling, but but the Department of Insurance has asked that they write, if you're going to use that, then a good portion of your book of business, a minimum of 85% of the state market share, should be written in wildfire distressed areas. And so, the goal has been trying to get people off the FAIR plan and to provide more commonly available, affordable market rate plans so that people are not forced to just go to the FAIR plan. And then there's been some modernization of the FAIR plan for expanding commercial coverage, as well as farm coverage and other things to be able to capture some other folks that were having trouble just accessing your insurance. So to do that, the insurance commissioner, Ricardo Laura, also created something called the Safer from Wildfires approach. And it's a three-pronged approach where he basically laid out a set of actions that insurers could write plans around and maybe offer discounts associated with it. And so there are three parts. There's the structure, there's the defensible space, and there's the community. So the idea that, if you have some of these attributes and if the insurer is interested in some of these attributes, there might be some discounts associated with that. So I would encourage you after tonight to go look at your policy and look at the rate sheet, which tends to be towards the back. And sometimes you'll be able to then get into the detail to be able to see if you are already receiving some of these. In my plan, I see some of those. The problem is that my insurance rate has gone up simultaneously, so the discounts haven't quite kept up with the rate increases. But so things that I've been talking about today: the Class A roof, the defensible space. The insurance companies really understand the Zone Zero, and they're remaining really committed to it. And so, having evidence that you've adopted some of that is, I think, really important at this point. Along with the Ember and fire resistant vents, having at least double pane windows, and closing the eaves. These are things that the insurance commissioner basically socialized, and the insurers already understand all of this stuff. And so we're starting to see some discounts associated with those activities. We're also seeing an understanding that the fuel adjacent to our structures, like the Zone Zero plus kind of working outwards, matters. And, they're able to use imagery to be able to assess condition on our structures and in our immediacy. And so, I would encourage you, as you do the work on your homes, to keep track of it, have like a brag book of work before and after, to be able to use that to help negotiate if you need to show that you are meeting some of their expectations and some of their standards. And then there's a third component, which is a community's working together. So there are discounts to be part of the Firewise program. That's in part what's contributed to the expansive growth of the Firewise program across California. But it's this idea that communities are working together and they're trying to share some of the responsibility and share some of their educational strategies so that we all start rising together and lifting together. So I'm going to, wrap up here by saying, the whole process is moving, I think, slower than any of us want. But I'm starting to see some stuff in 2025. I'm hearing examples that are coming on board. We're seeing that in Paradise, for example, that Mercury is writing new plans into the community of Paradise, especially when folks have done the work. I just heard some examples about that in Marin County and some pilot programs, I think, again, through Mercury, where there's recognition of how important these mitigations are, and an openness to try and help pull people off the FAIR plan into a regular admitted policy for work that you do. So I know that that doesn't satisfy the bottom line and the checks that you're writing right now and the vulnerability you feel, but I am optimistic that we're going to start to see some of this stuff really manifest and be more visible in our rates and our plans. So I'm going to wrap up here. We'll leave lots of time for questions here. And I just want to conclude by saying, the experience I have and what I see throughout the American West and even in Southern California, leads me to believe that there's a lot of reason for hope. And I know that I struggle with some of these big vexing issues, and I don't know I don't, it's hard to like figure out, what are the priorities? How do I work through these complicated issues? And, you just, it's like, but I want to have things that I can do that are within my control. And, reducing some of the fuels near my home, that's something I can control. Thinking about, home hardening and the actions that can be taken, yeah, that's within my control. I've just bought some of the new 1/8 inch mesh, and I just need to get a crimper, and I'm going to start to make some new additional vents for my house. And those things are going to start to make a difference. People ask me about, well, shouldn't we just do, structure hardening? That's the most important thing. And what I'll say is that homes survive because of many things, and they survive because the fuels have been reduced around them. They've survived because the structure's been hardened. They survive because the resident has been maintaining the functionality of the building product, as well as the overall details associated with what the plan is. And homes survive because you've got people that are first responders, and they're able to get to your house and add that additional line of protection. So it's, we're in it together. It's part of our shared responsibilities. And all of that, to me, I aggregate out to the sense that, fire adaptation is possible. It took a while to build California out the way that it is, and it's going to take a while to sort of turn that ship. But I think step by step we'll be able to demonstrate that that's possible, and that California can be a place for our children and grandchildren to live very successfully. So I thank you for the invitation tonight, and I'll leave you and Allison and Laura with a number of resources to be able to look at. Some are through the university, some are in partnership with other organizations such as the Living with Fire program in Tahoe. Some are from these big scientific investigations, especially the ones done by the National Institute for Standards and Technologies. And there are a lot of really fantastic educational resources and steps to be working through to address a number of vexing issues. I'm really impressed with the Fire Safe Mendocino website. I'm really impressed with the Fire Safe Marin website. They're well worth looking at. And I will stop share and close and turn it back to you guys for conversation.
Thanks so much for that, Yana. That was really, really good. So I know folks who are going to go till 7, feel free to hop off if you need to. And then if those of you that are still on, we can keep maybe 15 minutes for questions if that works for everyone. And Yana, maybe I'll just start by asking you a couple of these questions that are in the chat that have come in. So let's see. Alyssa says she's hoping for specific recommendations on home hardening in the talk tonight. I feel like you really went over that. Alyssa, feel free to comment back in if you have specific questions about it. Lisa says, I'm curious if folks who use these techniques have been able to maintain or, heaven forbid, lower their insurance rates. I think you did touch on that somewhat as well. Yana, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Which one were you looking at? Sorry, I got a little distracted.
From the beginning, 539, Lisa commented, curious if folks who've used these techniques have been able to maintain or lower their insurance rates.
Yeah, I mean, the stories are slowly trickling in. I'm not going to say that they're coming in with a tidal wave, but they're slowly coming in. And I apologize, I missed your comment around the time. So I wasn't looking at the chat while we were talking. So
no worries. Rose is asking, can artificial turf somewhat break the connection and act as a barrier?
Wouldn't that be nice? I mean, artificial turf is great at being able to reduce weeds and those kinds of things. Keep in mind that it's a petroleum product. There are some turfs that have some fire ratings with them. They're not all turfs that are available. And so, I certainly do see a smoldering effect on turf, and that can create a wicking effect. So if it's a place that really matters, I would prefer something that's not combustible over artificial turf because of those issues.
Great. Alice is asking, it seems like with huge losses due to urban conflagrations, houses in the WUI can actually be less risky because they can mitigate individually and then not be ignited by radiant heat from homes that haven't mitigated. Do you agree?
I do actually. I mean, I think there's different risks in different situations. Um, but you see less building to building interaction when you've got greater structure separation. That being said, I think, like if you look at our ranch or our farm environments, we often have many, I mean, like my cabin, it's got a wood shed and it's got, a generator shed and it's got a couple other things around it. They're all in close proximity because of the rain issue that I live in and the mud issue. And so then I've kind of created lots of structures in that environment. So it's not a uniform way to think about, but when buildings have more separation, you reduce the radiant heat issue significantly.
Great. Robert is asking what type of screens are on the retrofitted windows.
Yeah, and related to that image I showed, those were just regular screens. A metal screen is certainly more superior because it's not going to burn. But I'm just, giving you that idea that they still are blocking, even if they are, um, made of a different material, at least temporarily.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. If folks have questions, feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute and ask your question. We can kind of rapid fire and see if that works. Or feel free, if you don't want to speak up, to throw your question in the chat again. I'll read it out as well. Heather, I see your hand is up. Why don't you go ahead?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the point made on insurance is really interesting to emphasize, which is she said that as she was making adjustments, it wasn't really reflecting in her insurance rates because the companies are also making adjustments. I think that's something we have to keep in mind. We keep thinking, and I think people make adjustments, but they don't know that they're making adjustments because it's helping them. They're making adjustments because they're trying to lower their insurance rates. I don't know how to make that communication more clear, but I think it's important for people to understand that those adjustments are making them safer. And insurance is just going up, and it's going up because insurance companies want to make money. But I think a lot of adjustments are being made, and I'm not sure we're really capturing those in our own hearts as being something that's really helping. There's a second thing that I thought was interesting, which was when you are thinking of your fire plan, of your escape plan, one of the things that struck me was making sure that you do things like open gates and stuff like that, which I don't think is often considered. You think about your what you need to get out of your house, but also I don't know how much I've not heard a lot of people talk about walking around your land and thinking about how you get rid of things that are going to be fire. And that's something that I think might be really important to include in thinking about planning for getting out of your house when you think a fire is coming. Just a couple of comments, not really questions.
Yeah, well, thanks, Heather. I would say, and Allison, that we have some last minute checklists that we put together, and that is when you have the time, some things to be doing, like when you have 6 hours, some anticipation that, an evacuation may be coming and what you can do in that final period. Sometimes you only have 60 seconds, right? And your choice of action are very different than when you have, a longer lead in time to be thinking about some of this stuff. I also think about things to do just on red flag warning days in general, because things can go wrong and it's better to be better prepared than to be caught flat-footed in that environment. I think on the insurance space, let me just make it clear, and this concept that we've got a lot of shared responsibility right now. There's a lot of adjustment going around how we quantify the mitigations that matter and what the individual versus the aggregated effect of different mitigations are. This is all good stuff to prepare your house in general, and how they get ranked and scored and addressed is done by folks that we have no ability to ask detailed questions about. Each company thinks about these things differently. Each company is giving different scoring and rating differently. And, it's just kind of the way it is right now. I don't work for the insurance industry. I'm not trying to defend them. I'm just trying to kind of explain where things are going and how I anticipate things coming about. I think one of the key things to be conscious about is that the aggregated effect of the cost of wildfires across California is impacting our financial bottom line, at least at the $3,000 per year level. Our utility bills have gone up on average about $1,500 a year, and our insurance has gone up about $1,500 a year. So the combined shared impact, from other places is getting spread and distributed across California and across Californians. I hope, financial bottom lines are often the motivating factor for some folks. That's what, is the significant event that encourages people to take action. These are all sort of prudent things to be thinking about, and we're all in it financially and physically together. And, I just hope that we can inspire people to want to make some improvement, because it will have direct effect to them and indirect effect to us.
Awesome. Thank you, Yana. Alice, if you want to go ahead with your question.
Yes, I actually have two questions related to the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home, which has, slightly different than Safer from Wildfire. And so people are confused. Well, which one should I be trying to do? It gets confusing. And do you think that the Wildfire Prepared Home is actually undermining what the commissioner is trying to do with Safer from Wildfire? And then a more specific question related to that is that they don't think that they want the zone zero to be clear from the ground to the sky, whereas I think Safer from Wildfire, and also what the Board of Forestry is considering, is including large mature trees. So in other words, a huge pine tree that's limbed up 30 feet would be fine. Do you think that that's actually okay, or is it just that they're giving in?
Yeah, great questions. So you clearly are in the know, Alice. So the Safer from Wildfires program is really something for the insurers to be thinking about where they want to give discounts. This is sort of socializing some concepts. It was developed 4-ish years ago. I had one hand of being able to contribute some ideas to it. It could get modernized. It could get updated. The Wildfire Prepared Home is an actual assessment that you can do, and it gives you a certificate at the other side. And Farmers, for example, is recognizing those certificates and writing plans for people that meet the Wildfire Prepared Home standard. And there's a base level, there's a plus level, and there's a community level. And that, that organization is writing their own strategies, and it's not really in the public process. It's kind of a private sector solution in this space. It's different than the board's efforts. But, it gives recognition for certain levels of action. And the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety has made the conclusion that trees are associated with home loss. And they've, got big aggregated data where they're using an association between trees and home loss and seeing correlations between those two. I feel that that's not necessarily causation data. I think fuel management in general is a problem that trees can provide, but they provide a lot of other secondary benefits associated with temperature management, water retention, a number of other attributes that I think are really important for how we live in this warm state of ours. And so they're sort of difficult decisions. I do talk to people about choosing your long-term tree partner carefully. And this idea that they may outlive your marriage. That tree may live with you in your house longer than your marriage may be, and they can be just as annoying. They can, be messy in the bathroom and messy with debris, and they can get their roots underneath your foundation, and, they can cause issues. So, think carefully about the tree that you plant and where you plant it, and how it's going to grow and change over time. And I think if you've got trees that are close, really have to make a plan for being able to manage the debris and being able to get on top of it. I think gutter guards, non-combustible gutter guards, are really important. They take maintenance, but they're a key way to be able to mitigate some of that debris. But I still struggle with the idea that a tree at 5 feet versus a tree at 10 feet, I don't think they're that different in terms of the debris that's dropped. And when wind is at play, that debris is going to still land adjacent to your house, whether it's 5 or 10 feet away. So, there's some things to be worked out, some socialization around some of those core concepts that, I expect will start to change over time. But, the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection has made a very strong statement that they're willing to accept some of those issues and really encourage landowners and homeowners to be able to think about that maintenance issue, and but yet to recognize the other attributes that trees provide.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Yana. And then just we'll end with this last question in the chat from Fred, who's asking, when will Zone 0 be required by state law?
Yeah, well, again, once it is finalized, it will be immediate for new construction, and there'll be at least a 3-year phase in for existing construction. So if you already own a home, you've got some time to come up to speed. I don't know a single inspector that wants to lead with enforcement. I think they really want to lead with education, and they really want, to be able to recognize the work that you might be doing, and to understand that there are different abilities and different priorities that, and the phasing of those priorities may shift. So, for some, they'll be able to do it quickly. For others, it's going to take some time. And, working towards what you can do, I think, will be well regarded in that process.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much, Yana, for everything tonight. I hope you guys got a lot and got as much out of this webinar as I did. I just want to remind you that when you leave the meeting, there's going to be a brief survey that pops up. And if you could take a couple minutes and just fill that out, it helps us know what you guys want to see offered and what we can do better to tailor stuff for the community. So if you don't mind filling out that survey, that would be great. And then, yeah, mostly just thank you so much, Yana. That was really super enlightening.
All right. Well, thanks for being such a good audience. I'm sorry I went a little long there, but I think we still have some good questions. So look forward to hearing the stories of great success in your communities, and all the leadership that you all provide for your community. So thanks very much. Have a great night.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Yana, for your voice must be hoarse.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Allison, do you need to end recording?